Okay, so hello there, Emma.
Hi, Jude. How you doing?
Very good, thanks. Thanks so much for taking the time to join me today. I'm really excited as I've got so many questions to ask you around. Basically, without sounding crazily ambitious, I hope that we're going to tackle how people can change the world through a diversity of people. So,
Sure.
obviously, easily done within 45 minutes
No
or an
problem.
hour. I should maybe give some background for people who don't already know our connection. That we started off in knowing each other through Sense worldwide, which is a network of creatives and innovators and bringing people from all different diversity of background together. So that's always been a great sort of connecting point. And we'd even done things like supper clubs, helping big brands, small brands get together and share ideas from very, very disparate places that they usually would never even dream of interacting with. So it's kind of like super professional speed dating, I guess you could call it. But I
Yeah,
also
kind
want to
of.
talk about your most recent step, which is as community co-lead for Women in Innovation, which just sounds absolutely phenomenal. So please jump right in.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, we met. Goodness, that would have been about 2 years ago now. And it kind of, I think our meeting was serendipitous in the way that a lot of my meetings within my network are, where kind of energies collide without seeming too spiritual about the whole thing. But you do end up finding people, especially within the innovation space, who want to swap ideas and don't often have networks of their own to do that. So they have to forge their own. Um, Sense happened to be a place that did that. So Sense had a proprietary tool, what they used to call a proprietary tool for a long time before they opened it up to everyone, called the Sense Network. And that was about 5,000 people all around the world who were completely unlike each other. So you could have a single mum, a NASA scientist, and a beatboxer, and we would bring them together on projects to reimagine what futures could look like, so brands could then design for them. Um, and you take away the side of the consultancy work that we did, I found myself carving a bit of a niche for myself, collecting bonkers people who wanted to change the world, and that could be just through making things better around them in their family. I know you do a lot of like building with your kids, for example, or someone who is quite literally a NASA scientist, looking at kind of Earth satellite imagery and how to use AI modeling on it. You know, it's bonkers,
Wow.
but it's where the edges of those communities and those disciplines, it's where they collide, where really extraordinary things happen. And I think that energetic space is often where I find myself.
Yeah, and I think it's that sort of interesting thing of there's even despite the we're not going to get into a big COVID discussion because that's not really the point here, but there has never been more sort of pertinent time that people have realized you can either feel isolated or you can use, as we are now, the technology to sort of provoke different ways to sort of find some way to make a silver lining out of the situation. And dare I say it, I'm certainly exploiting the fact that most people are at home with less commute time and frankly just a little bit more comfortable, I find, to talk to when they're at home and just chilling in their jogging pants or whatever. So
Yeah,
it's
I
it's
can
it's
confirm I'm not in my jogging pants, but I am in my family home. So,
sorry, the last person was, so I just assumed that was the thing. So
no, I got dressed
but
up for this. It's fine.
but I guess one of those things is that to maybe get back to sort of useful questions for people listening to this, I hope, is that I've always sort of thought it's incredible when you have the visionaries and thought leaders, and you can take your pick of which there are, but even when you see young people like Greta, you can't help but feel that must be inspiring for a lot of young people, but there still must be that feeling of that might be a visionary and a guiding star, but what are my tools? How do I actually get a handle on any of these big global problems, which are so much bigger than me? Where the
Hmm.
heck do I begin? And I feel, would you like to talk a little bit about how you've tried to put together, I don't want to necessarily call it an A team because that suggests you just turned a key and fixed world hunger, but how is it you tackle problems which just really aren't about how do we sell the next yogurt pot, you know?
Hmm. I suppose my personal experience might be pertinent to share here because I have had a portfolio career my entire life. I started as a makeup artist and now I'm in innovation. You know, I think every time there has been a massive pivot, there's always been a strange region of transformation that happens around those periods, and that is really, really uncertain. And I look at, and I'm in one of those at the moment, moving from Sense to my role within Women in Innovation, which isn't full time, so there's other opportunities that I can explore. I find myself faced with the ambiguity and the stress of not knowing what the future looks like, versus the massive opportunity that comes with this kind of vacuum almost. And you have some people that find that very stressful, and you have some people that can almost take that and be like, okay, well, I'm going to inject my creativity into that space. Neither is right, because I suppose you have constraints either way. But I do think that we have to move forward. And looking back at all the other points, the kind of pivot points in my career, I never had a network. I had my close friends who understood roughly what my direct experience was, but nothing on the kind of the fleshy bits around the outside, around how stressful my specific industry was or anything like that. This time is completely different, because a little bit like the sales funnel, I've spent the last probably 5 years developing the most exquisite network of just bonkers people that we were useful to each other in the business exchanges that we had, or the personal exchanges that we had over those 5 years. But there wasn't really a specific value exchange that happened, like unless it was over a client project or something. Now I'm getting to the point where I can actually activate that community. In sales talk, you'd call it a long lead, or like the kind of the long tail of it. And I feel very proud that I invested that time in kind of nurturing these glorious humans around the world. And talking about digital platforms, it is completely global. I was chatting to someone in Tel Aviv yesterday, and most of the Women in Innovation core team are in New York. I'm not in any way restricted. Now more than ever, I'm less restricted to facilitate those communities, or community connections, so to speak. And that is an amazing thing. And I think that especially for young people who are much more digitally savvy than old generations, they have so many tools at their fingertips. It isn't a cookie cutter. Like, you might hate LinkedIn, in which case, 100% use LinkedIn. It's very useful, very good for professional things. But, a lot of professionals are on Instagram now, and that's how they share another part of their lives. So it's something that we always said at Sense, is that you're more than just your job title. And that is the case for anyone that I've ever met, even if you are like the most specialist, like nanotech scientists in the world, you probably have hobbies outside your job. And if that's the case, that's opportunities for you to connect more. So I think that when you're talking about the different platforms that you've got and the abilities to reach out to individuals, the world really is your oyster right now. Plus, COVID does help that everyone's in their house and is wanting energy from other people. I've had more conversations, and this, I think this is a global repercussion of the virus, is that people are wanting to connect more than ever because they are having their connections restricted. So I've caught up with friends that I haven't caught up with for years. It's very sad, but it is the case. And I've caught up with them like 3 times in the last week, So it leaves the space to create those connections now. It's an amazing opportunity, I think.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think it's that thing about also adapting to a little bit the unusualness of something. I wonder whether you could share a little bit on essentially not necessarily always getting into the COVID examples, but in many ways I've always felt that when I was working with you, we were always trying to unpick things or circumstances that were unprecedented. So a new technology, maybe to make it more tangible, one of the ways, if people aren't familiar, is that they usually assume that new technology, well, let's give it to some scientists or experts to figure out the potential. And I think we both know that sometimes you flip that and you give it to an artist, or you give it to a chef, or you give it to a musician. And sometimes that unlikely coupling, it's not to say that it always yields the perfect application, but it will definitely give a fresh perspective on how, the human interaction could be. So I just wondered, could you share some of the experiences from sort of, should we say, unlikely sweet and sour pairings that have worked out quite well?
Yeah, definitely. My favourite case study at Sense was always around the development of a new toilet cleaner. I know this sounds bonkers, but it was always my favorite because Sense were really brilliant at curating the right. I'm actually not going to say the right because it was the kind of, there was what's the word? We had a hunch. There were lots of hunches that they were normally paid off where you were like, I wonder if someone with severe OCD, like really like crippling OCD, may be able to help us understand what cleanliness means. Because to a normal person, cleanliness is just you get a bottle of Dettol or detergent or whatever and you clean something. And then because that, you know, the research has happened in the background, you're probably normally happy with the results. But if you're OCD, you are thinking about every single thing that could possibly go wrong. Like and it manifests itself very differently across different people, right? But this, I think it was a woman, and it was before my time actually there, but it was still my favorite, ended up showing us that to clean her toilet, she would wrap her toilet brush with toilet roll, and then wash her toilet and then flush the brush away and flush the toilet paper away. And we were like, eh? She was like, why would I want a dirty toilet brush sitting in my bathroom? And you're like, oh, you have got a very good point there. Yeah, that's... And suddenly it's like, ding, I'd never thought of that. There's a fantastic... by the way, as a result, Scrubbing Bubbles, if you Google it, is now a huge brand in the States about disposable toilet brushes. And that came off that research. But I think that there's a brilliant talk from one of the Apple designers. I think he was a designer, and he's talking about fighting habituation. And habituation is this idea that humans will just carry on doing stuff regardless, even if it is in detriment to them. If it becomes a habit, they'll just do it blindly. He uses the brilliant example of an apple, and he's like, apples, you check out with a sticker on them. That was designed to help people check out faster. But now with technology, you could leave and have paid without even having a human interaction at a checkout. It's like, why do we have something that to get it off, you have to dig your finger in and damage the product? And then you've got to wipe it on something else to actually eat it because it's left sticky residue. He was like, that is bonkers to me. And he was like, as a designer, my whole job is to be reflective about the world around me so I can fight crunch points like that. And my job is to find individuals that might help shed a different perspective. And, you know, the easiest kind of light and dark is the artist scientist. But I just think it is a really unhelpful polarity because both of them experiment. They just experiment in different forms and with different languages. And I think that as a connector, and I'm not saying that every student will ever want to be a connector. I mean, I used to be an introvert, right? I didn't, and to be honest, I still am. I still recharge on my own. And we were talking about this the other day. I've developed a career where I kind of get a game face on, and I understand that there are people like me out there that if without people like me would never talk to each other. And I just don't want to be part of a world where those people would never come together. So my job is the thing that only I can do, in the words of Neil Gaiman, and that is to connect people and to open opportunities within those connections. Not promising that anything will come out of it, but at least if I ever introduce someone on email, I'll always say, I have no idea what will come out of this, but I promise you'll have an interesting conversation at the very least. And that normally happens.
So, I mean, how do you feel as well? I mean, there's always these stories you remember hearing from innovators where their parents go, oh my God, you know, you wanted to be a comedian or an entrepreneur or something like this, which was sort of steeped in basically what looked like not a real job. And I kind of feel, and you know, I mean it in a respectful way, but it feels like Uber networker or bridge builder is like one of these jobs where people go, what? I mean, I even look at sort of, you've got community co-lead on your LinkedIn profile. Now, one of my good friends, David Over, was a community manager at Sugru back when people just went, what, you mean you go on Twitter all day? How's that a job? And so could you break it down a little bit for anyone, not just for the benefit of, validating your own profession, but why is it that we always go through this journey of being deeply cynical of things that always start a little bit ephemeral, but before they solidify into, sort of business acumen?
Well, it's very hard to quantify. You know, my network on LinkedIn is let's say 2,000 people. Great. How is that in any way useful to a business that works on profit margins, So I think that this is the case for a lot of people in a space that is a little bit grey at the edges, like community. So, for example, if I was to apply for a community role, I would likely be required to be a social media community manager. That is not what I do. There are people that are better at managing social communities than me. However, I understand network dynamics, and just even recognizing that there is an actual science behind networking, and this isn't just professional networking, but how networks interact, like nodes and all those things. That I have the blessing of being able to talk to people who are able to translate that type of thinking into more of a leadership style, I suppose. But I've actually forgotten now what you asked, because I started talking about network theory. I suddenly was thinking I had a network diagram in my head.
I guess I was sort of, where I was really trying to get to was ultimately, how do you legitimately charge for what you do when what you do isn't easy to put a KPI, a key performance indicator, or a metric to? You're dealing in something which is quite ephemeral and transient.
Yes, and that's why I brought up network theory. I remember now. It's so. I think you have to realize, and it's something that's taken me a very long time to realize, is that you kind of have to play the game. A lot of the time in this space, you are probably dealing with jobs that don't exist yet. The kind of the human bit on the data, for example. There's so much talk around big data, AI, machine learning, all those things that we haven't got yet to the point. I mean, there's an ethical conversation that's happening around it, but the human bit of it, there's still that matchup hasn't happened. I think that talking about collective intelligence and stuff is trying to do that. But I think that me being realistic is that my perfect role doesn't exist yet. Therefore, I do what I can in the space to make sure that I'm there and I'm ready and I've developed my career enough that I am able to move. And I think that this is the case, especially for a period of time like this, which is a little bit slower. You may not actually be able to move quickly on anything. It may just be a time where you rest and recuperate, is that you just got to sit into that and make sure that you're doing everything that you can to be ready to go. Whether that's saving money or joining loads of communities. Like the amount of communities that I've joined over the last couple of weeks I'm slightly concerned that it's too much, but we'll find out. But it's like, well, if you have this space, going back into that region of transformation again, it's like, well, if you have this space, fill it with stuff that is that matches your values. That means that when you actually get to the point where you can move, that you're ready. And I think that when you then are at the point that you could be taken on a journey like that, one, you'll be able to spot it quicker because you're using language that you've naturally been talking about and percolating and all that kind of stuff. But also you'll have sat with it so long that you'll hopefully work out, right, well, perhaps, so community is an interesting one because it could be, well, maybe it's strategic partnerships. That's community. You're dealing with connections between two people. It could also be people and culture because you're dealing with the internal dynamics of a business. But it could also easily be social media if that's what you choose, or maybe you're working in a VC and you're connecting companies with each other. So I think it's in time where you have time, is being able to spot those opportunities and be like, right, this isn't what I've been told. You know, I really wanted to be a photographer when I was younger. And I was told that I probably wouldn't make much money doing that. So I was like, okay, I'll just do something else then. Ended up being a glaciologist instead. But at that point, I really wish someone had come and said to me, but there's not just one way you can be a photographer. If you're really interested in law, you could go and be a photographer for a law firm. You just need to graft a little bit to find out who is in a position to share that experience with you. And I think the thing that I've learned most is that experience often comes from the most unlikely places. So to be open to the serendipity of maybe someone posts something weird on LinkedIn that you see and you're just like, oh my God, that is so, you're odd. Thank you. And just say thanks, and it may spark up a conversation. That it just takes a bit of openness and proactivity, I think, which I understand can be hard in times of uncertainty. But I promise you, just a little bit every day will just keep you ticking over, and I suppose prime you to be able to sell yourself well when the time comes.
So I think whether you intended it or not, it felt like you were giving some really good advice on how to sort of maintain a bit of resilience and a bit of robustness in adverse circumstances. And I kind of feel at the minute, of course, it would be easy to fall into the let's talk about COVID, but actually I think a more, should we say, universal thing you've gone through lately is actually going down self-publishing and writing a book. And I mean, that is extremely isolating. Even without a pandemic, you're forced to basically simultaneously explore ideas, but then also be brutal enough to edit them down to their essence in very extreme isolation. And you've had to make some quite significant life choices in order to achieve that. So I was wondering, could you break that down and take people through that journey?
Sure. So I think someone always asks, basically I'm writing a fantasy novel, which is wizards, whatever you want. It's amazing. And it gives me some of the biggest joy in my life at the moment. Actually, I've been doing it for the last 3 years. I think what's really interesting is when I started doing it, people again, like I was saying earlier, that kind of the pivot point in my career, they were like, oh, here she goes again, off on another tangent. And I was like, no, this one, now I'm a little bit more grounded in my experience of my life, I suppose, that I was like, no, it makes sense to me. And it took me about a year to work out that innovation and fantasy writing are exactly the same. All you're doing is you're making things up. Whatever any innovator ever says, you are creating stuff that doesn't exist yet. Fantasy worlds are exactly the same. But what they share is this idea that you have to suspend disbelief enough for someone to buy into it. For a fantasy world, you have to believe that there might be a troll under a bridge. In a kind of innovation landscapes, your client has to believe it enough that they're going to invest potentially billions of dollars in developing a product, and that that is then going to be bought. So I think there was a lot of safety in that realization, actually, that kind of the things that I love were connected not by discipline, but by mindset, I think. Even the other day, I was looking back at the innovation double diamond, the kind of discover, define, develop, deliver. And I was like, well, that's any idea ever. That isn't an innovation principle. That's just being smart and a problem solver. You know, for me, discovery for the book was signing up to the London Library. It's this tiny little library in the middle of London, not the British Library, which people think. And you go in and you walk down the crazy corridors that they have, and their Dewey Decimal System is completely different. So you can be standing next to a stonemasonry book, but opposite behavioral science and next to beaches. And you're like, huh. And suddenly you're in a world a little bit like the supper clubs that we were talking about, where you're opening yourself to new perspectives and you're allowing yourself the freedom to explore those. And I think that in a time, and again, I'll talk about time because we have it at the moment, when we're so busy all the time, and especially at the beginning of your career where someone's just like, just keep going. You just got to just do it. Like, stay busy, because busy is good. Busy means that you're earning money, that actually you may not be that productive. And I think that I'm more productive now than I think I ever have been, because I'm doing things that feed me. And that is a really glorious thing, I think, if that makes sense.
But I think as well, it's so interesting to hear you talk about that sort of understanding where your own center of gravity is in things. And I think that can be a really long, I know with my final year project as a student, and of course I'm relating this to some of the students as well, is the difficulty. And you think, how do I make this one project encompass everything I stand for? And that means that if I somehow betray myself or play it wrong, it means I'm almost going to go into a job where people think that that's me, and then I'll be working in a career that isn't me. And so it feels like there's this terrific weight that you have to define it right from the first time. And so I think this feels like a natural segue into, I guess, what we've always referred to as the power of the side hustle, that it takes some of that heat off. So could you sort of tell us a little bit about what your experience, not just for yourself, but also people within your networks, how have they approached the should we say, chocolate box or mixed palette of experiences?
Yeah, no, I suppose I say this from a very biased perspective. So definitely keep that in mind, because the Sense Network would. This is my dog.
Did someone say biscuit?
Please. Did someone say biscuit? Hold on. I don't know how she got in. Sorry, dude.
It's quite all right.
The joys of living with your parents.
but I also feel leaving this in, because I love the fact that actually this is the new reality at the minute. So this stays in. But anyway, but
also I think on a serious point, people expect networking to be this perfect thing, right?
Yeah.
Expectations are so much lower now. Like, when would that ever have been okay? in normal speak. And I think, so apologies to anyone that doesn't like dogs, but there are so many opportunities now to kind of test and learn and experience with it being a little bit messy, that use them. Although preferably
I think as well, just to overly validate that I'm not basically going to be bothered to edit any of this, but it actually, I kind of feel that often people think with networking it's always about having the hard edit, like, what are we going to talk about? How am I going to get value out of you? Bang, 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 bang. But anyone who's paying attention, who thinks, oh, I'd really love to speak to Emma, they've now got a glimpse into your personal life of like, oh, that you've got an awesome dog. I can definitely use that as an icebreaker. Just to be like super, super cynical, I kind of feel it's worth breaking down that point, that I think what separates, people who are comfortable in a networking environment, it isn't that they're cynically always looking to squeeze things and make it, tight and jam-packed. It's that they're loose and open to things that might have caught their eye in the distance. I mean, I keep looking at the background in your room of thinking, I have no idea what that little, whatever it is, candelabra type, lantern thing is in the back. But I kind of, I think actually it's the richness of people's lives that we sometimes forget to, like, don't put the blinkers on. People are more than just their jobs, more than just a singular thing. Which brings me back to the point before we got distracted with dogs of, how do we make a genuine case for the side hustle as not being a distraction or noise when we should just be getting on with it?
I think there's a much deeper around, I suppose, question around creativity and how creativity is even understood by the individual. When I was at Sense, because we had such a broad spectrum of individuals, we'd have accountants who just wanted an extra bit of cash, or maybe it was that they needed a creative outlet and they had no idea how to do it. Whatever it was, we'd often have people that weren't traditionally creative come be like, well, I'm not creative. I've heard this so many times. It makes me so angry. I would say accountants are probably some of the most creative people I know. The stuff, the wizardry that they can do with Excel just blows my mind. In the end, creativity is just problem solving, and how you apply yourself to and what problems you choose is kind of the type of creativity that you are kind of, I suppose, prone to. So I love creating things. Very different to you, though. In terms of the prototyping and the mechanical elements of it, I'm a bit more freeform. Like, I'm pressing flowers at the moment. I've just bought myself tile kits. And I like playing around with that. But also I have friends that really don't. And the thing that I'm always quite curious about, and I'm sure that this will be a piece of research in my life at some point, is it because they don't want to be creative, that they don't want to produce? Or is it that they feel like they can't because they can't call themselves that? And I definitely have had this. It took me 4 years to call myself a writer. Now, by default, I write. Therefore, I am a writer. But this whole idea that I have to have some sort of published work to call myself an author, it's crazy. And actually, as I kind of, I made a specific decision to hang out with people that were writing, and I met some of the most amazing people that I've met over the last couple of years have been writers and content producers, because they have an ability to get what's in their head out. They're storytellers, and I'm very fascinated by that. And I think that being able to then put yourself in a position where you're surrounded by people who are just naturally using that language anyway. Doesn't matter if you're not doing it. You can be a spectator if you really need to. And I was for about a year. And then suddenly I was like, one day I was like, okay, I'm going to start trying to call myself a writer and see how it goes. And now I'm like, well, I'm a writer. I'm not published yet, but I'm a writer. And that gives me a lot of energy. And I see that a lot with, with the sense network side of things, that everyone in it, and again, this is what I mentioned bias before, I bias because everyone was this way, kind of, they all were very proactive in this sense, and they all had side hustles. But the one thing that I suppose I get very sad about is the 9 to 5 a little bit, in the sense that creativity you can't just jam it into the bit before work and a bit after, but sometimes you need to. If you are an accountant, but you're also a painter, you're going to have to find ways to get that into your life. And that can be really difficult because people are busy. It's a time thing. Or it may be that it costs a lot of money to buy all the kit and have a painting course. So there's an inclusivity point of view. But I think that the thing, and again, my brain working too fast for my mouth, tying it back right to the beginning about KPIs, is that you can't prove the value of that accountant going and doing his painting and how much joy it brings him and potentially productivity it brings him to the 9 to 5, because that 9 to 5 doesn't allow it to happen within the time. And I think that Google's 20% rule, I know that you did it at Sugru with your team. I think that people that recognize this side hustling, side hustle is an interesting one because it denotes that you may earn money from it. Now, obviously, I would like to earn money from it, but that's not the reason that I do it. So, and hobby kind of trivializes it, but other interests outside the thing that earns you your wage, I think is very, very good. I'm 100% better at my job as a consultant and as a community builder because I have been researching mythical fantasy narratives. There's an understanding of a collective consciousness now that I didn't have before. And if anyone's ever read Joseph Campbell's Man with a Thousand Faces, he talks about the idea that every fantasy story has kind of a monomyth structure within it. And I'm like, well, again, this whole pressure of I don't create because maybe you want to be the best at something or I'm not unique enough. It's like, well, if every fantasy narrative pretty much has the same structure, then you just need to create a different context for it. Not all of it has to be unique. So there are different ways and levers that you can do to pull the pressure off yourself to explore these places, I think. And that's never really told to you when you're young. That's something that you learn from failing a lot and just getting really, really annoyed that you can't do the thing that you really want to. And it makes me sad that a lot of people spend their entire lives not having that realization or having the support to give them the kick that they need to explore.
Yeah, I often get very frustrated at this whole sort of mantra of fail fast because, as far as I can tell, I've never met anyone who's ecstatic when I waste a ton of their money on something that failed. It doesn't matter how many volumes of learnings or presentations where I show the silver lining, no one is happy that it tanked and burned. Yet it usually the only reason you get away with it is if you've actually done a lot of things which were very successful. So I think as well, like no one puts the asterisks that says fail fast after you've built a little bit of muscle to like suffer it. I mean, if you said this to a bear, you said, right, are you going to hibernate when you haven't eaten anything? They'd be like, no, I'm going to go gorge myself and then I'll take the hit. And I kind of feel a little bit like a lot of creative resilience to take bigger chances. People who you see as being maverick, it's often that they've built a little bit of fat reserve in order to do something really crazy ambitious. I'm sure you're able to write a book because you've put aside a little bit of an income that allows you to take that hit financially because you realize you need to double down on some creative endeavors, which, I'm sure there's still that part of hope for that you're doing it for yourself, but you hope that it might be a successful novel as well, which
definitely.
Of course that's just human nature. So I think it feels sometimes frustratingly that people don't always break it down for people that actually if you either have no experience or you've taken a lateral move, which means you have no experience in that new field, that it's okay to sort of put your hands up and say, I need some support. And of course it can be financial, but I think getting back to some of the things you're very adept at, I think you've drawn expertly on knowing when you need a mentor or when you need someone to help push you through through difficult situations. So I was wondering, maybe you want to talk a little bit about like how that works for women in innovation, because let's not beat around the bush. This is a community that needs mentors more than ever, for all the reasons which I'm sure you're going to get into. So,
yeah, I mean, look, women in innovation. To caveat, I was always quite uncomfortable with going into gender-specific groups for a very long time, mainly because I understand that, or my experience has shown me, that diversity in the truest sense of life experience, which therefore includes things like gender, ethnicity, race, religion, all those things, that you just need to have a platform that includes all of those things. However, those conversations aren't happening properly, and definitely action is not happening off the back of those properly. So in the interim, places like Women in Innovation that are hugely energetic, like just having been part of the leadership team for the last, let's say, month, it's extraordinary. This happened while COVID kicked off, right? So we went from total in-person programming across London, New York, and San Francisco, to fully digital global programming across all of them. I mean, it's really remarkable. I was in an amazing kind of leadership webinar the other week where they kind of, it was incredible. They hacked Zoom brilliantly. They had breakout rooms and everything. But I think what was quite interesting is that the expectations of that community have changed slightly, because they've gone from ticketed events where they turn up to still ticketed events, but where you sit and you watch. So as the leadership team, understanding how that's all working is fascinating. But I think that there is I don't know, especially within the innovation space, there are hardly any leaders that are women, right? And I kind of got to the point where I was like, I'm not seeing myself. I'm not seeing a version of myself like ahead. Like there's no one's familiar to me that I'm looking up being like, cool, or very, very few of them. So after a bit of kind of beating around the bush and being like, oh, I don't want to go to these because they're too exclusive, blah, 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 I got to the point where I was like, you work in innovation, change it. Find people that think the same as you. Go to a couple of these groups, see what they like. Some of them I really didn't like. And then I found Women in Innovation. I was like, oh my God, these women are so smart. And they have really smart conversations. And the thing that I really loved was that their program, the live programming that I went to, the panel that they had was completely diverse. So obviously at the time they were all women, but they came from completely different backgrounds. And as a result, gave amazing perspectives to a really broad, like you had really senior and mid-level people within the crowd. And I suddenly was like, okay, this I can get on board with. So now I find myself helping with all the stuff that I know from managing the Sense network and bringing that knowledge into Women in Innovation. And it's a really cool place to be. And a specific instance that's happened at the moment is we know loads of people are losing their jobs. So we're like, right, what's the point of working for a global community if you can't connect with the global community in a time of crisis? So we just created a Google sheet that has 4 tabs, one with people actively hiring, one with people actively looking, a kind of a mentoring one as well, where people can offer their time for people to reach out, and then any other useful resources that people that either are hiring and have never done it remotely because it's a challenge, right? Or that people that are looking for jobs, any kind of tips and tricks that they can use. So it's just been really amazing to see how small things like that, and touching on your mentorship point, is like looking for people that can help you. Even if you have a rough idea, you're like, okay, like mine. I was like, I know that I really want to see other versions of me ahead of me in my career, so I can talk to them and work out how I get there. And that could be male, female, whatever. But I would like to talk to a woman about it because they have a very specific life experience, and then work out how to find those people. And that's, I mean, you're working with a course that is specifically around problem solving. And I think a lot of the time, because it's a personal problem, people don't necessarily explore it with the same rigor. I mean, literally put the double diamond on it. You've got to go wide first, right? And I think it's a very interesting, and it can be quite an uncomfortable place to be, to actually reach out to these individuals. But it's amazing when you find them, it just fits. It's like finding your best mate. It's like suddenly it's like, oh my God, you get me. I felt this with you a little bit, actually. I was like, oh my God, you can put up with my brain working too fast for my mouth and just sit with me while I remember what the question was. and women in innovation is that for sure. I'm very excited to see what they do next, and be part of their journey. It should be brilliant.
And I think maybe I just want to address what I feel is an elephant in the room for maybe some people watching this, which is that, I have to confess and say, when there was, I'm always someone who's sort of felt very excluded at times. I think it's partly because I was mixed race. My parents were basically Londoners who had moved up to Cumbria. So I used to go and speak like a Cumbrian yokel to my friends at school. And quite literally, my grandparents, when they came up, they could not actually understand what I was saying, because it was like a deep Cumbrian dialect. And so I've always felt a little bit like I hate this sense of marginalization, but then at the same time, it's quite wonderful when you fall into a group that truly gets you. And so I feel as someone, when I saw the sort of movements of sort of women in innovation, not to be specific to your group, but just the general movement, I always felt like, yeah, but I never wanted to be with all the bros. I hate that community. I've been to Silicon Valley. I hate the over testosterone fueled, move fast, break stuff, coding till 3 a.m. in the morning or whatever. It's like, that was never my group. And I always thought, man, I wish I could be in some of these more emotionally sensitive places, because that's actually my disposition. But then, strangely, bear with me on the long story, but since becoming a dad, I think the closest I could say that any men might be able to empathize with why there is a need for women to have a safe place is that actually, I think this is the closest men get to discrimination of what women go through. That when I would carry around my newborn son, and I would walk into like a parents group, it was called, but I was literally like the only guy there. And it was like walking into a bar, the Western Saloon where the piano stops, and all the women would look and just be like, is this man here to create some sort of damage? And then I would have to almost go out, bring my child back in, and they'd be like, oh, it's okay, he's a new parent. And even then, it was still a very difficult reception, because you could tell that there were conversations which were obviously very personal and very nuanced and very female specific, and I felt like an intruder. And so the flip side of that is I also now admit that I have like a little dad's group, which has helped me articulate things where I go, oh gosh, not a lot of guys open up about this. It's a complex subject. And if there were a woman in the room, sure, they might intellectually be like, I get you need to say it, but you're censoring yourself. And so I guess what I'm trying to articulate is I think one day this will not be a problem, that people will truly, I'm sure Sweden is already leagues ahead with this by giving
Latte
like paternity.
Yep.
Exactly. I think there may be many steps ahead. And as someone who's very deliberately at Sugru, we had a team of 12 people in R&D. There was 50-50 split on gender. There was 7 different nationalities. I do this as my business as usual. I strive for diversity. But I think I've also had to just be a little bit honest sometimes and go, you know what? Yeah, sometimes a subgroup is allowed and it has a function, because it is a safe haven.
It's subgroups, I think, are very necessary, because safe spaces is an interesting one. I think that some spaces do have to be safe, but safe incites an idea that they're being attacked, and like I say, a lot are, right? But I think the core of it, and the core of this entire conversation, whether it's a personal thing or a professional thing, is being able to foster a sense of belonging and I mean, this is something that they have entire teams doing for culture, right? In business, like these big businesses, even small businesses, where you're like, how do you foster a sense that someone feels secure and as though they're part of this whole, compared to an outsider? There's a brilliant talk. I'll send you the link. I can't remember for the life of me who did it.
Include it below, but yeah.
Yes, include it below. But he talks about how the actual physical experience of exclusion, like mentally, it has a physical, I didn't explain myself very well. The mental experience of exclusion has physical pain, like pain. If you were to like prick yourself or whatever.
Yeah.
So you can understand why it is a very, very quite literally painful experience to be excluded. And I think as a result, finding places where you feel included and that you belong are very, very important. You have to then have a situation that you're fostering such openness within that should you talk to someone, and this touches on things like politics as well, is that if you talk to someone that wants to debate with you or has an opposing view, that your core knowledge of yourself and your beliefs is strong enough to have a robust conversation about that, but that you're open to it in the first place. And I think that, gender politics, for example, is never going to get solved by loads and loads of subgroups working. It's a little bit like loads and loads of cancer research companies all competing for funding. Like there's a reason that they all came together.
Yeah.
And I think that there's the beauty in diversity. So you feel like, yes, you're in a place that you feel that you're belonging, like Women in Innovation. I feel like I really belong as part of that community. But I'm also recognise that I need to talk to people outside that community to make sure that that community works. There has to be, the ambition is to close the gender gap in innovation. That can't happen with just women doing it, because currently there are way more men in innovation than women. So it's a very pragmatic problem solving, but it takes curation.
And I would be lying if I said I didn't curate the team at Sugru and I didn't also curate this series of talks. I mean, it's still, I would like more diversity, not just from gender. I think gender, actually, I find quite easy to get 50-50 split. Haven't struggled at all. But actually sort of cultural perspectives, that's hard. I'm probably going to have to think really hard if I want to find just that right connection from someone in Japan. But I don't know someone in Thailand, and I've only got one friend in Singapore. So it's still, where do we also say that is someone behaving with the right characteristics of openness, or are you just virtue signaling by going, oh, look, look at me, I've got my friend from whatever ethnic minority. I think at the end of the day,
I feel like if you're doing that, it's you.
Exactly, and I think that's where brands get it wrong, is when they go, well, I'm deliberately painting a picture which isn't really syncing with the true values of the company and the culture, etc. And I think we can only move as fast as like a genuine display of inclusivity, and which is why I think it makes sense to go through this period of giving space and voice and acknowledgement before the pendulum swings back to a place which truly is what we're all fighting for. Yeah,
definitely. And I think that, talking to the inclusivity piece, because, look, there's never been a better time, especially in research, to be researching across the most diverse spectrum possible because of technology. Nearly everyone has a mobile phone now, or at least some access to a mobile phone. They don't all have access to computers, but way more people than ever do. So you're like, well, if you think about ethnographies, you had to have big budgets to go over to those places to actually interview those individuals in person. Those budgets don't necessarily exist anymore, but we have the technologies that allow us to, you're literally in my house right now. So I think that how you reach those places, whether it be for researching a new product to develop or looking at how you want to increase your network, there's never been a better time to do it. You just need to be curious enough and be okay to be knocked back. Like, there are people that are, from a networking perspective, that are just too busy at the moment. They're probably dealing with crises. Maybe you're just coming out of university and you're trying to talk to the CEO of a company. I think you've got to be a bit realistic that may not happen. But there may be someone would be your direct hire, or the person above them, that you could reach out to instead. So it's like working out what your hit list looks like, in the same way that a piece of research at Sense would have worked. Like, we used to have matrices where we would work out what are our hunches as the people that maybe it's an army major on leadership, or like leading in times of ambiguity. Couldn't think of anyone better. Anyone that's worked in kind of Afghanistan probably has a pretty good idea of what that looks like, versus a single parent where pretty much everything is ambiguous and they have to do it all on their own. Very, very different perspectives, but you can end up putting a matrix and a bit of a hit list together as to the type of person that you could talk to. And then you go and talk to them. And if they're right, great. If they're not, well, you've had a really interesting conversation off the back of it, and hopefully they have too. I think at that point, you got to be confident that you have a value exchange there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the thing that you're selling. Like for us, it was client work. But most of the time I was just talking to people because it could be that they work for that one, but it also could be that they would come to a supper club at some point, or just go for a coffee next time I'm in New York. But that's just how my brain works. There's a much more long tail version of it, I suppose. But there's definitely power in it. And I would encourage everyone to explore it if they can.
Mm. And I guess sort of I'm just thinking of I think you basically just summarized everything really beautifully there. And it's not to say that we can't retrospectively throw in a few links for anyone who's wanting to like riff off some of these discussion points. But is there any sort of final thoughts or reflections that you feel for people who maybe haven't considered themselves, that they found their right tribe, or that they, how to find, those connections? What's been some of the great, tangible things that have helped you?
I was very, very lucky that I was almost forced to experiment with this with sense. At the beginning, I was like, oh, these people are like, Jude's a prototyper and he makes things with his brain. And I'd be like, oh, I don't do that. So we couldn't possibly have a conversation. But I think the biggest thing for me was writing the book, because I suddenly felt like I was stepping into the shoes of someone with my network. I had a side hustle. And at that point, it was never really about the side hustle or my job. It was about my experience of trying to juggle both of them. And so one, I would say, if you have anything that you want to explore outside work, do it. You don't have to be amazing at it, but like put time aside. So at the moment, for example, I know that it's a bit of a weird time where I've got work flying in and out. It's not necessarily, definitely not 9 to 5. And it's also, a lot of it is in US time. So it's very late hours. And I'm like, right, the thing that I know is going to annoy me the most that I don't do today is write a few words. So I get up at 7:30, I sit down at 8, I write 2 or 3 pages of just stuff out of my brain. They're called morning pages. And then after that, I make sure I write until 10 a.m. Doesn't matter necessarily that it's the book, but at the moment it happens to be. And it just means that the thing that I've done that day before anything else is the thing that I really want to do. So I've got energy out of that. So as a little tool, doing it in the morning where you have the willpower just sets you up quite nicely. But it was interesting. I was actually talking to someone that deals a lot, is a wonderful man called David Pacifico. And he does a lot of career consultancy. He's heavily involved in transformation of, like, he used to work at GSK, big business transformation within kind of teams and culture. And he was saying, well, why don't you treat it like a project? Like, work out the type of companies that you want to work for that align with your values. So, for example, I don't really want to work for a company that produces snacks. I feel like my brain could be like the kind of the Pepsi. I really, really respect them, but personally, I wouldn't want to work for a PepsiCo or something. As a result, I would also really like to help them as a client, for example. So I would love to be involved in research projects for them, but to actually work in a business like a big corporate like that, it's just not my cup of tea. And I'm like, right, okay, well, I now need to find 50 companies that I feel comfortable working at. I feel that's probably quite an easy hit. Right, and now who in my network, in first, second, third connections on LinkedIn, might be able to help me talk to those individuals? So it becomes a really, really pragmatic way, and not an emotional way, of actually leveraging your network to find results. And you don't need to sell anything in particular. It's not like, give me a job. It's, well, could I possibly ask you for a coffee for 5 minutes in your morning? Or would you know anyone in your business that may be able to connect me to someone that may be hiring for this role? Or just, what's the culture of your business like? Because I'm looking at making my first step into that space. I think you can be quite tactical and action orientated around it. It doesn't need to be this thing that you're this like master networker who's constantly switched on and always looking for opportunities. Like, a lot of people just aren't like that. And I think that just know your limitations and work within them, and just chip away at it day by day. Because I promise you, the long tail that it will give you long term. There are still interns that I hired that I'm in touch with that I worked with like 10 years ago. because they're just super proactive
same.
and they check in every now and again. And I respect that and I remember them. And if I ever need anyone to work on my team, when I set up my multi-million-pound business at some point in the future, they will be the first people that I hire, because I know and I trust and I know that they belong to my kind of like-minded, progressive type of thinking. So I think that would be the very pragmatic steps.
Oh,
do stuff in the morning and do lots of little things during the day.
I think that's honestly the best closing point is to not be fooled by the epic media headline that it often starts with small habitual changes on the day. So thank you so much for what's been a great conversation, and
No
I know you'll come back with a dozen or so links probably, and I'll include those for anyone, as it's always amazing what comes to your brain and you think, I wish I had said that. But let's use the technology as a virtue for those that second wave. But thank you again, Emma. It's always a pleasure and
my absolute pleasure.
an inspiration.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Amazing. You too.
Bye.
Bye.